Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. From daring jewel heists to mysterious legends, every video uncovers the secrets hidden in the shadows. Stay with us, because here, every crime tells a story. He walked into the interview room smiling, calm, and confident. He thought he could control the story, that his lies were strong enough to hide the truth. But he didn't know the FBI had already seen through him. Every nervous laugh, every glance away, every crack in his voice was a clue, and when he made one tiny mistake, his entire story collapsed. In this video, we'll break down the chilling interview that exposed a liar and show how FBI profilers used body language, hidden signals, and relentless pressure to reveal the truth he could never hide. The small interview room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent light above. The walls were plain gray, the table scratched from years of use, and the single camera in the corner blinked red as it recorded everything. In that room sat a man named Thomas Gray. He was 42 years old, with short hair and a nervous smile that never seemed to leave his face. To most people, Thomas looked ordinary. He was the kind of man who blended into the background, never drawing too much attention. But to the FBI, he was the prime suspect in a case that had left an entire community shaken. It all began when a woman named Laura Bennett disappeared. Laura was a nurse at the local hospital, known for her kindness and dedication. She was last, seen leaving work late one evening. Her car was found abandoned in a parking lot, her belongings still inside. For weeks, investigators searched for her, questioning friends, family, and co-workers. But one name kept coming up: Thomas Gray. He was not a stranger to Laura. He lived only a few blocks away and often stopped by the hospital cafeteria where she worked. Some co-workers recalled seeing him linger a little too long near her, trying to start conversations she did not seem interested in. At first, no one thought much of it. People said Thomas was just awkward, maybe lonely. But when investigators dug deeper, they discovered he had a history of troubling behavior. Years earlier, another woman had filed a complaint against him for following her home from work. The case never went to court, but the file remained in the system. Now, with Laura missing, Thomas's name stood out once again. The FBI brought him in for questioning. He came willingly, dressed in a plain button-up shirt and jeans, smiling as though he had nothing to hide. He told officers he wanted to help and that he cared about finding Laura as much as anyone else. But the agents knew better. They had studied men like Thomas before. Men who believed they could outsmart the system with charm and half-truths. That was why they called in the profilers. Across the country, the Behavioral Analysis Unit had built a reputation for reading people in ways others couldn't. They studied facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, and the subtle changes people made when they lied. They understood that no matter how confident someone was, the body always betrayed the truth. For Thomas, this interview would become the moment when his mask began to crack. The lead interviewer, Agent Carter, sat across from him. Carter was calm, steady, and patient. He began with simple questions: where Thomas had been on the night Laura vanished, what he remembered seeing, who he had spoken with. Thomas answered quickly, almost too quickly, as though he had rehearsed every word. He leaned back in his chair, smiled at the camera, and tried to appear relaxed. But Agent Carter noticed the details. When Thomas claimed he had gone straight home, his eyes shifted slightly to the left. When he described making dinner, his voice grew tight, his words rushed. To anyone else, it might have sounded normal. To the FBI, it was the language of deception. Back at headquarters, profilers watched the live feed. They studied Thomas closely, taking notes each time his story wavered. One profiler, Agent Ruiz, pointed out how Thomas often touched his face when answering difficult questions, a classic sign of stress. Another noticed how he avoided using Laura's name, referring to her only as that woman or the nurse. These were small details, but they painted a picture of a man struggling to control his lies. As the hours passed, the tension in the room grew. Thomas's smile began to fade. He shifted in his chair more often, his hands restless on the table. When Agent Carter asked if he had ever followed Laura outside of work, Thomas laughed nervously and said, "Of course not." But his laugh was hollow, his voice slightly higher than before. The profiler noted the change. Liars often tried to hide behind humor when the truth pressed too close. Still, Thomas thought he was winning. He believed he was in control, spinning a story convincing enough to keep suspicion away. He did not know that the very things he tried to hide were the things giving him away. The FBI continued to build pressure. They showed him photos of Laura, asked him to recall details about her routine, and pressed him on why so many people remembered seeing him near her. Thomas insisted it was coincidence. "I'm just friendly," he said. "People misunderstand me." His voice cracked slightly on the word friendly, and the profiler underlined it in her notes. A crack in the mask. Outside the interview room, Laura's family waited. They wanted answers, but they also feared the worst. Her mother sat quietly, clutching a photograph of her daughter, whispering prayers under her breath. The agents knew that time was running out. Every second mattered. By the end of the first day of questioning, Thomas was still denying any involvement. He smiled again as he was escorted out, acting as though the whole thing was an inconvenience. But the FBI profilers saw what others could not. They saw the sweat on his forehead when certain questions were asked. They saw the way his jaw tightened whenever Laura's name was mentioned. They saw a man trying too hard to look innocent. Enid. The reports that night, Agent Ruiz wrote a simple line. Subject is lying. Body language and speech patterns confirm deception. Recommend continued interrogation with pressure applied. For Thomas, the game had just begun. He believed he could keep his story straight. But the FBI had already spotted the cracks. It was only a matter of time before the mask he wore would shatter completely. The second day of questioning began with the same quiet tension that had filled the room before. Thomas Gray walked in confidently, his shirt freshly pressed, his smile rehearsed. He greeted the agents as if they were old friends, but the FBI team knew it was nothing more than an act. They had seen men like him before, men who thought charm could cover lies. Agent Carter remained calm, sitting across the table with a folder of documents in front of him. The camera blinked red in the corner, capturing every movement, every breath. The FBI profilers, once again watching from another room, leaned forward in their chairs. They knew that today was about pressure. Yesterday had been about setting the stage, listening to Thomas's story, letting him feel in control. Today would be different. Carter began with simple questions, the same ones Thomas had answered the day before. "Where were you on the night Laura disappeared?" he asked. Thomas repeated his story word for word. He claimed he had gone home, cooked dinner, and watched television alone. His tone was confident, but the agents noticed the details. His hands rested on the table, fingers tapping ever so slightly. A profiler wrote in her notes, "Nervous tic, increased tapping when repeating rehearsed answer." The FBI knew that liars often practiced their stories, repeating them exactly the same way each time. But the truth is never that perfect. People who tell the truth recall events with natural variation, adding or forgetting small details. Thomas's story was too polished, too exact. Carter leaned forward. "What did you make for dinner that night?" he asked casually. Thomas paused for half a second before answering. "Pasta. Just pasta." Carter nodded but asked again, this time more firmly. "Pasta with what?" Thomas hesitated again, his smile flickering. With sauce, red sauce. I always make it the same way. The profiler underlined the pause in her notes. It was the kind of hesitation that signaled improvisation. The questioning continued. Carter slid a photograph across the table, and an image of Laura smiling at a work event. You knew her, didn't you? He asked. Thomas looked at the photo and shrugged. I saw her around, he said. She worked at the hospital cafeteria, that's all. But the profilers caught it. Immediately. His voice dropped when he said, that's all. His eyes shifted down to the table, and his hand brushed his nose. Small signals, but powerful ones. Agent Ruiz, watching from behind the glass, whispered, He's distancing himself. He avoids using her name. That's deliberate. Another profiler added, He can't look at her picture. Guilt response. The agents decided to push harder. Carter leaned in, his voice steady but sharper. Witnesses saw you near her car the night she disappeared. What were you doing there? Thomas laughed nervously. That's ridiculous. I wasn't anywhere near her car. People must be confused. I was at home, like I said. His laugh echoed. In the small room, but it lacked warmth. It was hollow, a shield against the pressure. The profiler made another note. False laughter. Avoidance. Thomas tried to steer the conversation back in his control. He spoke about his job, about how much he cared for his students, about how people misunderstood him. He painted himself as the victim of gossip. But the FBI let him talk. They knew liars often revealed themselves when they spoke too much, and he did. He slipped when he said, I barely even talked to Laura outside the hospital, maybe once or twice near her car. Carter caught it immediately. Near her car? He repeated. Thomas froze, realizing his mistake. I mean at the hospital parking lot, that's what I meant. His face flushed, his eyes darting. The profilers leaned forward. That single phrase, near her car, was the kind of crack they had been waiting for. The tension grew heavier. Carter pressed harder now, laying out timelines, pointing out inconsistencies. You say you went straight home, but a patrol car logged your license plate near the county line at midnight. How do you explain that? Thomas shifted in his seat, his smile gone. That must be wrong. Maybe someone copied my plate. Mistakes happen. His voice was louder now, defensive. The profiler circled the note. Raised voice. Defensive posture. Caught off guard. For the first time, Thomas's calm mask was slipping. His hands clenched into fists on the table. Sweat formed on his forehead. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms tightly across his chest, a defensive barrier. The agents did not let up. They played recordings of witness statements, each one placing him closer to Laura in the days before she vanished. They asked why his phone records showed gaps, hours where his location couldn't be traced. Each question chipped away at the wall he had built around himself. Thomas's responses became shorter, sharper. He denied everything, but his denials no longer sounded convincing. His body betrayed him. His foot tapped rapidly under the table. His voice cracked when he said, I didn't hurt her. The profilers wrote the note in bold. Unexpected denial. Not prompted. Indicates fear. Hours passed, and Thomas grew exhausted. His hair was messy, his shirt damp with sweat. Gone was the confident man who had walked into the room smiling. In his place was someone struggling to keep control, clinging to the story he had rehearsed, but failing to keep the cracks from showing. Agent Carter ended the session with a quiet statement. We'll talk again tomorrow, Thomas. Think carefully about what you've said. Thomas tried to smile, but his lips barely moved. He knew the walls were closing in. When he was escorted out, the profilers shared their conclusions. He's lying. Every part of his body says it. The slip about her car, the defensive posture, the unprompted denial. He's cracking under pressure. Another round of questioning will break him further. Thomas still believed he had a chance to outsmart them. But the FBI had seen enough. They knew it was only a matter of time before his lies collapsed completely. The third day of questioning began with heavier air in the room. The gray walls seemed to press closer, and the hum of the fluorescent light felt louder than usual. Thomas Gray walked in looking less confident than before. His shirt was wrinkled. This time, his eyes tired and his forced smile weaker. He still tried to greet the agents with a calm voice, but his nerves showed in the way he rubbed his hands together as he sat down. Agent Carter was already waiting at the table, a thick folder open in front of him. The camera blinked red in the corner, and behind the glass, the FBI profilers were ready. They knew today had to be different. The time for patience was over. Today, they would push until Thomas slipped again, and this time, the mistake would be undeniable. Carter started by repeating the same questions, letting Thomas fall back into the story he had told twice already. He claimed he went home, made dinner, and stayed there alone the night Laura disappeared. His voice was steady at first, but the more he repeated the rehearsed words, the more lifeless they sounded. The profilers scribbled notes. Tone flat, memory rehearsed, no emotional detail. Then Carter shifted. He placed a photo on the table, Laura's car abandoned in the parking lot. He slid it toward Thomas slowly. "You're sure you weren't near her car?" Carter asked. Thomas froze for a fraction of a second before forcing out a laugh. "I told you already, I wasn't there. People must be confused." But Carter leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "We found your fingerprint on the driver's side door." Thomas's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For a long second, the room was silent. Then he stammered, That's impossible. I might have touched it another time, maybe at the hospital. Everyone. Park's there?" His voice was higher now. His words rushed. The profilers watching from behind the glass nodded to each other. "He's panicking. Look at his hands." Thomas was rubbing his palms on his jeans, trying to dry the sweat. His eyes blinked rapidly, another clear sign of stress. His lie was unraveling. Carter didn't back down. "Your print was fresh?" "Thomas, it wasn't from weeks ago. It was from that night." "Do you want to explain that?" Thomas's shoulders sagged. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if searching for an answer. Finally, he said, "Maybe I walked past her car. Maybe I touched it without thinking. That doesn't mean anything." His voice was quieter, his confidence gone. The agents knew this was the first undeniable connection between Thomas and the crime scene. His mask was slipping faster than ever. To build more pressure, Carter pulled out another folder. Inside were phone records showing gaps in Thomas's location data. "Your phone was off for 3 hours that night," Carter said. "Why?" Thomas shifted in his seat, his arms crossing tightly over his chest. "Battery died," he muttered. But the profiler's notes were clear. Defensive posture, short answer. Classic avoidance. Carter pressed again. "You told us you watched TV at home. But when we checked with the cable company, there's no activity on your account for that night. You weren't watching anything." Thomas's jaw clenched. He looked down at the table, avoiding Carter's eyes. His voice cracked as he said, "I don't remember. Maybe I just sat there, I don't know." The profiler underlined it. Memory collapse, losing control of narrative. The agents knew they had him. They began to circle closer to the truth, asking about his connection to Laura. "You liked her, didn't you?" Carter asked. Thomas shook his head quickly. No, I barely knew her." But his body betrayed him. His cheeks flushed, his breathing quickened, and his hands trembled on the table. The profilers wrote, "Emotional spike, concealed attachment." Then came the moment no one could ignore. Carter placed a scarf on the table, sealed in an evidence bag. It had been found in the woods near the county line. "This was hers," Carter said. "Her family confirmed it. And your DNA is on it." Thomas's eyes widened in shock. He leaned forward, staring at the bag, his lips trembling. That's not possible. Someone planted it. You're trying to trap me." His voice rose, almost shouting. But the profilers wrote a single word: collapse. He reached out as if to touch the bag, but pulled his hand back quickly. His breathing was fast, uneven. The man who had walked in confident and smiling 2 days ago was gone. In his place was someone desperate, cornered, and unraveling. Carter's voice remained calm. "Thomas, this is your chance to tell the truth. You were there. You know what happened." For a moment, Thomas was silent. His eyes darted around the room, looking at the walls, the camera, anywhere but Carter. Then he whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen." The profilers froze. It wasn't a confession, but it was close. An unprompted statement like that spoke volumes. He hadn't been asked about intention. He had offered it himself. It was the crack they had been waiting for. Carter leaned in, his tone softer now. "Then tell us what happened. Help us understand." But Thomas caught himself. He shook his head violently. No, you're twisting my words. I didn't do anything." He leaned back, folding his arms again, trying to rebuild the wall. But it was too late. The slip was recorded. The FBI had the first real admission from his own mouth. When the session ended, Thomas looked broken. His face was pale, his body slumped, his hands trembling as he was escorted out. Behind the glass, the profilers agreed. "He's unraveling. His lies are falling apart. Another push and he'll confess." For the first time, Thomas knew he was losing control. The story he had built, the mask he had worn, the lies he had practiced, they were no longer enough. And deep down, he could feel the truth pressing against the walls he had built. The fourth day of questioning began with a different atmosphere. The agents no longer treated Thomas Gray as just a possible witness. Now, he was the prime suspect, and he knew it. The walls of the small interview room seemed to close in tighter around him. The camera in the corner blinked steadily, recording every move, every breath, every word. Thomas looked weaker than before. His shirt was the same one he had worn 2 days earlier, now wrinkled and stained at the collar. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled as he adjusted the chair before sitting down. He tried to smile again, but it was a poor imitation of the grin he had carried in on the first day. The confidence that once protected him was slipping away. Agent Carter sat across from him, calm and steady, his folder thick with evidence. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply waited until Thomas settled, then began. "Thomas, you said you went home and cooked pasta that night. You said you stayed home alone, but we now know that isn't true. Your fingerprint on Laura's car, your DNA on her scarf, those aren't accidents. Help me understand how this happened." Thomas's lips parted, but no sound came out. He rubbed his hands together nervously, his eyes darting toward the door as if searching for a way out. Finally, he said, "I told you. I wasn't there. Someone must be trying to set me up." His voice cracked on the word someone, and the profiler watching from behind the glass noted it immediately. Carter leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Thomas, we've spoken for hours. You've tried to keep your story the same, but the cracks are showing. You slipped when you mentioned her car. You slipped when you said you didn't mean for it to happen. That's because the truth is fighting to come out." Thomas's eyes widened, and he shook his head quickly. No, you're twisting my words." His hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white. Sweat formed on his forehead. Agent Ruiz, observing with the other. Profilers whispered, "He's cornered." Defensive posture. Look at the fists. He's preparing for the confrontation. Carter let the silence stretch, knowing silence could be more powerful than questions. The ticking of the wall clock seemed louder. Thomas shifted in his chair, his foot tapping rapidly against the floor. Finally, Carter spoke again. Thomas, lying won't save you, but telling the truth might help you. What happened when you saw Laura that night? Thomas's breathing grew faster. His shoulders slumped. For a moment, he looked like he might speak, but then he shook his head violently. I don't know what you're talking about. I wasn't there. His words were sharp, but his voice cracked at the end, betraying the fear underneath. Carter pulled out a photo and placed it on the table. It was Laura smiling, her arm around a co-worker at the hospital. She deserves the truth, Thomas. Her family deserves the truth. They've been waiting for answers. Thomas stared at the photo, his lips trembling. He didn't reach for it, but his eyes locked on her face. The profiler watching noted emotional connection, guilt surfacing. Carter pressed again. You followed her, didn't you? You waited near her car. Thomas whispered, no. But the word was so soft it barely carried across the table. His jaw clenched, his eyes filled with panic. He was unraveling. To increase the pressure, Carter revealed another piece of evidence. We found your shoe print in the woods near where the scarf was discovered. Same size, same brand. You were there. Thomas's face went pale. He shook his head, but no words came. His lips moved as though trying to form an excuse, but nothing came out. The profiler scribbled, shock, narrative collapse. He can't hold the lie anymore. Carter leaned closer. This is your chance, Thomas. The evidence is here. The lies are breaking apart. Tell us what really happened. Finally, Thomas slammed his hand on the table. I didn't kill her, he shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. Sweat dripped down his temples, his breathing ragged. The agents froze, and then Carter asked softly, Then tell us what you did do. The outburst was unprompted. It was another slip, but this time louder, clearer, and recorded. The FBI knew they had moved him closer to the edge. Carter didn't push for a confession yet. Instead, he let Thomas sit in his own silence. The suspect slumped in the chair, his shoulders shaking, his fists unclenched now, resting limp on the table. For the first time, he looked small, powerless. Behind the glass, the profilers discussed their notes. He's breaking down. His denial is no longer about the entire crime. It's narrowed to, I didn't kill her. That's the truth bleeding through. He admits involvement, even if not directly. Thomas whispered to himself, so faint the camera barely caught it. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Carter leaned in quickly. What do you mean, Thomas? What went too far? Thomas shook his head, refusing to answer, but the slip had been recorded. When the session ended, Thomas was led back to holding. His face was pale, his body weak. He no longer looked like the confident teacher who thought he could outsmart everyone. Now he looked like a man carrying the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. The FBI had enough cracks to keep pushing. They knew the mask was gone, the lies failing, the truth pressing closer. All they needed was one more session, one more round of pressure to bring the full confession into the open. The fifth day of questioning began under a heavy silence. The agents knew they were close, and Thomas Gray knew it too. The cracks in his story were wide now, his mask almost gone. He had shouted, slipped, and whispered fragments of truth he never meant to say. The FBI team decided today would be the day they pushed him until the lies collapsed completely. When Thomas entered the interview room, he looked exhausted. His hair was unkempt, his shirt untucked, and his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He sat down slowly, avoiding eye contact with Agent Carter. His hands trembled as he clasped them on the table. For the first time, He looked less like a man in control and more like a man cornered. Agent Carter remained calm. He opened the thick folder in front of him and spread photographs across the table. The abandoned car, the scarf, Laura's smiling face, the footprint from the woods. "Thomas," Carter said quietly, "we've gone over this again and again. You've tried to hold on to your story, but every time, the truth comes through. Today is the time to stop lying. Tell us what happened." Thomas's lips tightened. He stared at the photographs, his jaw clenched. Finally, he said, "You're wasting your time. I already told you everything." But his voice lacked strength. It was shaky, defensive. Carter leaned in slightly. "You said you didn't kill her. That's what you shouted yesterday. If that's true, then tell us what you did do, because right now the evidence says you were there. Your fingerprint, your DNA, your shoe print. You can't explain that away." Thomas rubbed his temples with both hands, groaning softly. He looked like a man who wanted to disappear. I didn't plan for this," he muttered under his breath. The profilers behind the glass leaned forward immediately. One whispered, "That's an admission of involvement. He's moving closer to confession." Carter kept his voice soft but firm. "What didn't you plan for, Thomas?" Thomas's eyes flicked up, wide and panicked. He shook his head quickly. "You're twisting my words again. I didn't mean it like that." But Carter didn't let go. "No one's twisting anything. You said it yourself. You didn't plan for this. What did you mean?" Silence filled the room. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed louder. Thomas shifted in his chair, his foot tapping rapidly on the floor. His breathing grew heavier. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and uneven. I wanted to talk to her." Carter nodded slowly, not interrupting. He let Thomas keep talking. Thomas swallowed hard. "I saw her that night leaving the hospital. I thought maybe she'd listen if I caught her alone. She never wanted to talk to me inside, with everyone around, so I waited near her car." His voice cracked on the word waited. The profiler wrote in bold, "Direct admission, confirms presence at crime scene." Carter kept his eyes on Thomas. "What happened next?" Thomas rubbed his face with both hands, his voice trembling. "She got scared. She told me to leave her alone. She tried to walk away. I grabbed her arm just for a second, but she screamed." His breathing quickened, his shoulders shaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I just wanted her to understand me." The room grew still. Behind the glass, the profilers exchanged quick glances. They knew this was it, the collapse of his lies, the confession forming. Carter leaned forward. "Thomas, where did you take her?" Tears welled in Thomas's eyes. He shook his head, whispering, "I can't." His voice was barely audible. Carter's tone softened. "Her family deserves to know. They've been waiting for weeks, living in pain. You can help them. Where is she?" Thomas broke. His shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands. His voice cracked as he said, "The woods. I left her in the woods." His words echoed in the room like a hammer striking. The profilers scribbled furiously. "Full confession. Admits location of body." Carter spoke gently now. "Show us where. Help us bring her home." Thomas lifted his head, tears streaking his face. "I'll take you there," he whispered. His voice was hollow, defeated. The man who thought he could outsmart the FBI was gone. When the session ended, Thomas was escorted out, his body slouched, his face pale. For the first time, he walked without resistance. The profilers reviewed the footage, noting every sign, every slip, every moment where the lies fell apart. They had seen the transformation, from a smiling, confident liar to a broken man admitting the truth. Outside, Laura's family waited. They didn't yet know what Thomas had confessed, But the agents knew soon they would finally have answers. The FBI had broken through. The mask was gone. The liar was exposed. And the missing woman's story was about to be revealed. The morning after his confession, Thomas Gray sat in a holding cell, staring at the floor. His face was pale, his hair messy, and his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The weight of what he had admitted the night before hung heavy in the air. For days he had lied, smiled, and convinced himself he could keep control. Now, there was no mask left. Detective Sarah Collins and Agent Carter entered the cell quietly. They didn't need to raise their voices. Thomas looked up, his eyes hollow, and nodded before they even spoke. He knew why they were there. "I'll take you," he said softly. "I'll show you." A convoy of cars left the FBI field office that morning. Thomas sat in the back of one, handcuffed, flanked by 2 agents. The ride was silent. He kept his eyes on the window, watching the trees and streets pass by, his lips moving slightly as if whispering to himself. Behind them, another car carried, the profilers. They weren't just there to observe. They wanted to see how Thomas acted outside the interview room, away from the table and the bright lights. The convoy stopped near the edge of the county line, where thick woods stretched for miles. The area was quiet except for the crunch of gravel under the tires. Thomas was let out, his hands still bound, his steps slow and uneven. He looked around nervously, glancing at the trees as though the ghosts of his lies lingered there. "This way," he muttered. His voice shook as he pointed toward a narrow trail leading into the woods. Agents surrounded him, their boots sinking into the damp earth. The autumn air was cold, and the forest was heavy with silence. They walked deeper, into the woods, the light fading under the canopy of trees. Thomas's breathing grew heavier. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. The profilers noted every movement, the way his shoulders hunched, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he paused before each step as if stalling. Finally, after nearly half an hour, Thomas stopped. He stared at the ground, his chest rising and falling quickly. "Here," he whispered. His voice broke. "This is where I left her." The agent spread out, scanning the area. The ground was uneven, covered in leaves and branches. A faint depression in the soil caught their attention. Carter signaled to the forensic team, who had followed behind. They began carefully clearing the area. Within minutes, they uncovered what no one had wanted to see: the remains of Laura Bennett. The forest was silent except for the sound of digging and the occasional snap of a branch. Laura's scarf, the same one found earlier, was nearby. Pieces of jewelry her family had described were still with her. The scene was heartbreaking but undeniable. Thomas stood frozen, his face pale, his lips trembling. For the first time, tears slid down his cheeks. He muttered to himself, "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." The profilers watched closely. This wasn't guilt for the crime, they noted, but fear of consequences. His tears weren't for Laura. They were for himself. Detective Collins turned to him, her voice steady but sharp. "You took her from her family. You did this, Thomas. And now the world will know." Thomas didn't respond. He slumped against a tree, his head hanging low. The agents led him away as the forensic team worked carefully to preserve the evidence. Behind the glass of their observation earlier, the profilers had seen his lies fall apart piece by piece. Here in the woods, they saw the final collapse. Back at the office, the news spread quickly. Laura's family was told the truth at last. Her mother wept as she clutched the necklace recovered from the site. Her father sat silently, his fists clenched, his eyes full of pain and anger. They had feared this outcome, but hearing it confirmed broke them all the same. For the FBI, the case now shifted from suspicion to proof. They had the confession, they had the evidence, they had the body. There was no more room for Thomas to hide. The profilers prepared their final notes. Subject exhibited classic signs of deception throughout interviews: controlled posture, rehearsed answers, distancing language. Cracks began when confronted with physical evidence, escalating to unprompted denials and partial admissions. Confession was inevitable under sustained pressure. Agent Carter sat at his desk late that night, reviewing the footage. He watched Thomas on the first day, smiling, confident, calm. Then he compared it to the footage from the final session, pale, sweating, whispering the truth. It was the full arc of a liar undone. Thomas now faced charges of kidnapping and murder. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. The community of Cedarfield, once shaken by Laura's disappearance, would finally have answers, though not the ones they prayed for. But for the FBI, the case was more than just solving a crime. It was a demonstration of how lies, no matter how carefully crafted, always crack under pressure. The body gives away the truth even when the mouth refuses to speak it. And in that interview room, with the camera blinking red and the profilers watching every move, Thomas Gray had exposed himself. The trial of Thomas Gray began 6 months after his arrest. By then, the story had spread across the country. News stations replayed clips of him walking into court, his hands cuffed, his once neat appearance replaced by a tired and broken figure. People who had once seen him as harmless or even friendly now saw him for what he truly was: a liar who lived behind a mask and a man who had taken a life. The courtroom was full on the first day. Laura Bennett's family sat in the front row, their faces heavy with grief. Her mother clutched a small photograph of her daughter, whispering quietly to herself. Her father stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, refusing to look at Thomas. Reporters filled the back of the room, their pens ready, their cameras waiting. Thomas walked in, escorted by officers. He tried to keep his head up, but his eyes stayed low. He no longer looked like the man who once thought he could outsmart everyone. His face was pale, his hair unkempt, his shoulders hunched. He avoided Laura's family, avoided the crowd, and focused only on the floor beneath his feet. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the evidence: the fingerprint on Laura's car, the DNA on her scarf, the shoe print in the woods. They played recordings of Thomas's interviews with the FBI, showing how his story changed, how his mask slipped, how his words betrayed him. The jury watched closely, their eyes shifting from the video screen to the man sitting at the defense table. The profilers testified as expert witnesses. They explained how Thomas's body language revealed deception: the tapping foot, the forced laughter, the defensive posture. They described how his rehearsed answers gave him away, how his sudden denials signaled fear, and how his unprompted words, "I didn't mean for it to happen," were the cracks that led to the truth. The defense tried to argue that Thomas was misunderstood, that the FBI pressured him into saying things he didn't mean, but the evidence was too strong. The jury had seen the footage. They had heard the confession. They had seen the location where Laura's body was found. There was no escaping the truth. Laura's family listened to every word. Her mother often cried softly, wiping away tears. As the details were read aloud, her father clenched his fists, the pain visible in his face. They had waited for justice for too long, and now it was within reach. When Thomas took the stand, he tried once more to save himself. He spoke quietly, claiming he never meant to hurt Laura, that it was an accident, that he only wanted to talk to her. But his words rang hollow. The jury had already seen through the lies. They had seen the man behind the mask. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On the final day, the jury left to deliberate. Hours later, they returned. The courtroom fell silent. As the judge asked for their decision, the foreman stood and said the words Laura's family had been waiting to hear: guilty. Thomas Gray was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, his head hung low, his shoulders slumped. The man, who once smiled confidently in an interview room, was now just another criminal caught by his own lies. Outside the courthouse, Laura's family spoke briefly to the reporters. Her mother held her daughter's photograph and said, "We finally have justice. Nothing can bring Laura back, but now the truth is known. He cannot hurt anyone else." Her father stood silently beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with both sorrow and relief. For the FBI, the case became a lesson studied by new agents and profilers. The footage of Thomas's interviews was used in training, showing how even the most practiced liar leaves traces of the truth. His nervous laughter, his avoidance of Laura's name, his sudden slips, each detail showed how the body betrays the mind. Agent Carter later reflected on the case. "He thought he could outsmart us," he said. "He thought if he smiled enough, if he rehearsed enough, he could keep control. But the truth always finds its way out, and when he made that one tiny mistake, the rest of the mask crumbled." The story of Thomas Gray spread far beyond Cedarfield. It was told in documentaries, true crime articles, and news specials. People were fascinated by how an ordinary man, a face that seemed so harmless, could hide such darkness, and how the FBI exposed him piece by piece. For Laura's family, the pain would never fully fade. But they held on to the knowledge that justice had been served. They visited her grave often, leaving flowers and prayers, remembering the life she had lived and the kindness she had given to others. Her story became a reminder to the town of Cedarfield that evil can sometimes hide in plain sight, behind familiar smiles and ordinary faces. Thomas, meanwhile, spent the rest of his days behind prison walls. The confident teacher, the smiling neighbor, the man who once believed he could fool everyone, was now just another prisoner, watched every hour, his lies useless in a place where no one believed them anymore. The interview that had started with charm and confidence had ended with truth and justice. It became proof that deception, no matter how clever, always leaves cracks. And in the end, those cracks are all it takes to expose a liar. You've just seen another chilling story from the world of true crime, but there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us as we unravel more heists, mysteries, and untold legends. Don't miss what's coming next, because in the world of crime, the truth is always stranger than fiction.